how would you expect a cook stove developer or a distributor to go about employing some of these techniques? So, just some rules of the game. In the interest of time and fairness, I'm going to ask the presenters to present, and we will leave questions till afterwards, so that we don't get distracted by one particular presentation at the expense of others. And I hope you'll accept that little rule. We have presentations will be about 10 minutes each, and then move the panel and then start the discussion. So please note down your questions and hold them for when we get everyone together. I think that's the best option. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker. This is a colleague of mine, Fiona Lamb, who is a research fellow based at the Stockholm Environment Institute in the Stockholm office, where she leads the initiative on behavior and choice, particularly focusing on cook stoves. Fiona's a self-confessed stove addict, and she's got about 250 stoves now, which she calls her children. Sadly, her real children find this a bit upsetting, but she's going through therapy, so good luck, Fiona. So I'll hand over to Fiona now and for her presentation.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Oliver, for that introduction. And thanks everyone for joining us today in this super cozy room we have here. It was switched at the last minute from another smaller room, so I guess that's good. But just to give you a brief overview of, in a nutshell, what I'll talk about today. I'm going to be talking about design, service design methods and why they can be useful in this space. And how we've piloted them in a case study in Kenya to understand the factors driving adoption of advanced pellet biomass cook stoves. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on the findings, but for that you can look at our report that's forthcoming. They're interesting as well, but more to get across why these methods can be of use when understanding all the different drivers that Oliver referred to, and crucially translating that information and knowledge into action on the ground. As Oliver mentioned, this is part of a larger research program at SEI, where we've got some funding from the Swedish government to look at all of the different drivers of behavior, from peer effects, intra-household relationships, internal factors, everything. And we're given the small task of building a conceptual framework that can capture all of this and be useful for implementers trying to support adoption of their technologies in the field. Our approach is to do a series of in-depth case studies of household-level technology interventions, the first two of which will focus on cook stoves, but later on we're hoping to look at other technologies as well, so that the conceptual framework is applicable beyond just cook stove technologies. Again, to emphasize that the case studies are just as much about testing and developing methods as they are about gathering empirical data that we can use to then populate a conceptual framework later on. So what I'm going to talk about now is the first part of the first case study, where together with a team of Swedish service designers, we piloted service design methods to look at the drivers of individual and household choice and behavior related to the uptake, as I said, of advanced pellet stoves, specifically the Philips cook stove in Kenya, in Kiambu County. And it's a program that's ongoing. The cook stoves being introduced by a microfinance group. And they were looking for useful insights on how to improve their program to ensure that more customers buy the stoves, but also that the ones that are purchasing the stoves are happy customers. So backing up a little bit, what are service design methods? Service design is essentially a collaborative, creative approach for understanding the wider concept of people's lives in order to design or to improve a product, service, or system that people will use and maybe even love and recommend to others. It takes the principles of human-centered design, which you're probably familiar with, similar to what folks at IDEO and elsewhere have been using, but with much more of a systems approach, systems thinking injected into it. The methods are used for identifying problems, creating solutions together with the user, And crucially, it's an iterative, highly iterative process. So we start out really wide, with the wider context of people's lives, and gradually prototype and test ideas together with the user so that we, with each loop, get closer to what we hope is an actionable solution. So there's four main stages in service design. The first, there are interactions. And this is essentially talking to people, understanding the context of their lives. Deep, open-ended interviews, getting people to tell their stories, where people themselves decide where to put the emphasis. In Kenya, we piloted this with 24 in-depth interactions with women who had either signed up to get the cook stove or were already using the cook stove. And we basically asked 1,000,001 why questions. So they would tell us something, we would try, as Julia said yesterday, to go beyond the first answer and to really go deeper and find out what the drivers of the decisions are. Next comes insight generation, where the team sat down and quickly analyzed what we were getting from the first round of interviews, what seems to be coming up as barriers, opportunities, problems, and even ideas for addressing these. This overlaps with the next phase, ideation. Some call it like rapid prototyping. So we quickly came up with initially very rough ideas, but could this be a way to solve this particular difficulty in the system or problem that people seem to be facing? These are then sketched, physically sketched as pictures, visualizations, trigger material basically, which we take with us into the next round of interviews. So we have something that we can physically show people to provoke them, to engage them, to encourage them to react and critique and even tear up the trigger material if it's terrible. And it allows us to gather more information, useful insights, but also to problem solve and come up with creative solutions quite early in the process. And these 4 steps are part of one loop. And ideally, you would do 2 or 3 loops in one study. We managed to do 3 in this case. So we used the data we gathered during this process to construct what's called a customer journey map. It's just a way of visualizing users' experience over the entire journey of getting a stove. We can break the journey down into stages and pinpoint where the user is having difficulties along the journey. This is a kind of zoomed out version of the customer journey map, but just to give you an idea of the main pain points and the main positive parts of the system. For example, you can see early on, waiting for the stove, there's a thundercloud there representing a pain point for the customer. Later on, using the stove all the time, people are happy, there's a heart representing a happy customer. And when we did this in Kiambu, we realized that this is actually a really useful tool for understanding how behavior changes over time, where people can fall off the path to adoption. And crucially, when you show it to partners, implementing partners, it's a way for them to suddenly visualize where things may be going wrong in the system that they were not able to see previously. And it's all coming from the user's perspective. And we have more detailed maps as well. This one is going into the risks in a lot more detail. So even where there's a heart representing happy customers or a very positive part of the journey, for some users or subsets of users, there are risks of reduction in usage of the cook stove. There's risks of misuse of the cook stove in the early startup phase, for example. So we have lots of different maps that I wasn't able to include in this presentation, but it's just an idea of what we can use the customer journey to generate. From all of the data and from the customer journey maps, we were able to extract some more, I guess you would call them generic insights on what's happening with adoption and what the key drivers of behavior are and what's happening in this particular case, but they could be applicable in cook stove interventions elsewhere. And many of them sound very obvious and generic, and I guess you could say service design, it doesn't often come up with brand new insights, but what it is useful for is looking at the old insights or things that people kind of know instinctively and connecting them really well to the users' experience, and also suggesting ways, workable ways of solving the problem. So this insight here, a cook stove must meet the end user's definition of improved stoves. This sounds really obvious, but often it's the implementer has an idea of why the stove is useful. It could be a health improving cook stove or something good for the environment or time saving. But it's the user's definition that counts. And when people are making up their minds whether to purchase a new stove, they evaluate many variables, but measurable ones like money and time saved, they're just some of the variables that are considered. There's also soft values, such as a modern image or social status, and also crucially, the past experience of each individual user will critically affect their decision to purchase and use the stove, as well as their expectation of the cook stove. I don't know what's happening with the lights here, but it's a little distracting. And then another example of an insight we got, that the startup phase, when the user first starts using the stove, is the most critical phase. And this for us sounds very obvious, but for the implementer, that's often where a lot of the resources and time and effort is put into the marketing prior to the startup phase, and then the distributor or the implementer disappears from the scene because their job is done. But we found that this is where habits start to form. This is when people find their way of using the cook stove, for better or for worse. This is where maybe mistakes start to be made. And these are some quotes that people said to us, that they burned the food in the beginning, they didn't realize how to use the stove. Or that they were having a really great experience, something that they didn't realize was going to happen with the stove happened, which was a bonus. Okay, I'm nearly out of time, but this is what we did once we had generated all of the insights and constructed the initial customer journey map. We brought the various stakeholders together, the microfinance partner, the NGO, which was SNV that was supporting them, and some others, and presented it to them, and then together mapped out different actionable ways, using the customer journey as the starting point and mapping out where the pain points were that had not been apparent to the implementer from the beginning, but together use the map as a way to work out how we could improve the system, but based on each stakeholder's capabilities, capacities, and budgets, and so on. So some really creative ideas came out of this, using the women themselves as support systems for each other in the startup phase. It was one example, and there were many other examples that you could mention. So winding up, as I said, this was a pilot, an attempt to pilot a method. I hope it came across that it was very useful, that it gave us most of all, interesting, useful way of visualizing what's happening across the entire journey, not missing out on any of the stages. A way for us collaboratively with other stakeholders to problem solve around where the pain points and the ways to improve the system could be. We have some other streams of research that are going on within the Kenya case study. We will also do social network analysis in the same area. We will do a political economy analysis to see what's going on in the whole cook stove sector in Kenya, and then ultimately hope to synthesize all of this research to come somewhere towards a conceptual framework that we can hopefully test in a further case study next year. But our report will be out soon, and we will share that with the Alliance, of course. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. That was wonderful. Okay, I'm going to ask our next speaker to come up. This is Sami Horn from Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, where she's a research associate and leading a number of different projects. And we went out for dinner last night, had a few beers, a few of us, and Sami admitted that sadly she has actually never cooked in her life before because she grew up on a strict diet of raw veg and milk. And I think this strange behavior was what led her into working on behavioral economics, thinking, how do people make these different decisions? So it's very exciting to have Sami here. The work that Busara is doing is fascinating, not just in the cooking space, but in other sectors as well. But Sami's been working on a couple of projects in the cook stove space that we'll hear about now. So thanks very much.
Switch it on, there we go. Thank you, Oliver. To clarify, I'm vegan, which doesn't necessarily mean that I only eat raw vegetables and milk, but yeah, maybe that's driven the interest. So, do I need to open me? Just some technical assistance. I'll start anyway. So I'm a research associate at the Basara Center of Behavioral Economics, which is based in Nairobi. And in this brief presentation, I'm going to touch upon our approach to understanding problems both in the cookstove space and more broadly. Some highlights of a couple of studies we've done on cookstoves, and then lastly, just some brief discussion points, if I can get there within 10 minutes. So Basara is a center that applies findings in behavioral economics to, in our advisory side, programs and policies, and in our research side, we conduct this research. So working with academics to further understanding of behavioral economics in a developing context. So what is behavioral science? Just briefly, it's understanding behavior through a process of both observation and experimentation. So the experimentation side, we have a lab in our offices. It's a lot of quantitative work with the initial qualitative side. And I'll go across how our approach works in terms of cookstoves in a bit. So the way that we approach an issue, especially on the research and advisory side, is to understand first the context. And this will involve a lot of qualitative work, focus groups, understanding consumer views, and then applying a behavioral framework, which I'll go into, and then testing the behavioral intervention that we decide on. The behavioral framework is really the application of behavioral science, which I'm sure it's been in the press a lot. It's a very popular topic, and I'm sure everyone has some understanding of how this can be applied. There's a few different organizations doing this. So very basically, you'd think of the movement from thought to action as thought, you think about whether you want to purchase a cook stove, the decision, and then finally the action of actually purchasing. And where we come into play is this sort of curly areas between each of these where that can go off track. It's actually similar to what Fiona was talking about in terms of points where the consumer might change their decision. So between thought and decision, it can be anything from social norms not being in that direction, there just being too much information, the information not being communicated properly. And then between decision and action, it can be things like procrastination, self-control. We all don't do things that we think we should do. And where we come in is trying to understand what these barriers are and tailoring programs and products to overcome them. And there's a lot of behavioral biases that we look at in determining what's important. I'm not going to go through all of these, it's quite a heavy slide. But for instance, people tend to be more loss averse than they like gain. So the idea of losing something is more salient than gaining something. Social norms, the decisions of your community have a big effect on what you think is a good thing to do. People like the status quo, or default options. People rarely change defaults, and the same with information overload. If you give people 10 options, they tend to make worse decisions than if you just gave them 2. So it's understanding which of these biases can come into play in this specific decision. And then we test an intervention to see if it works. And the way we do that is normally with a randomized control trial, which I'll touch on briefly, but I think there's been a lot of press again on these things. But basically, take a load of people or households, randomly assign them to either a treatment group or a control group so that those groups are the same. It's roughly the same income, same gender breakdown, and then you do something to the treatment group and you don't do it to the control, which allows you to see this impact. And this is the sort of the final stage of our process of seeing how things work. Now I'm just going to briefly touch on a couple of studies, one that was done with SNV and another one was done with SEI in Kenya. So with SNV, they wanted to look at the impact of health campaigns on cookstove uptake. So we recruited just under 1,000 respondents in Kiambu County, which is 2 to maybe 4 hours outside Nairobi, depending on traffic, and then recruited them into these 3 different treatment groups and a control group. So the treatment groups, everyone was given health awareness, which was based on public health messaging. And then for one treatment group, we gave that information in SMS form 5 days following our staff and the community health worker going to their household. For the graphic imagery, we showed them pictures of the effects of smoke on the lungs, a bit like those anti-smoking campaigns, and the goal setting was more of a psychological aspiration intervention. And then everyone was given a marketing campaign, so every village had a demonstration of the stove. And the idea was to see, like, A, is health campaigning effective on people buying stoves, and B, whether it can be made more effective by these little tweaks. Now, there's a couple of just points that I'll touch on in the study, is that first of all, like, people were already very aware of the health risks. Like this slide, which is slightly confusing, but everything is navy blue, is a percentage of the people that agreed with these statements on the effects of smoke. So we sort of went in there, and S&B had chosen this area thinking that health awareness was low. In fact, it wasn't. And I think this comes back to something I'll say later, and that context is very important. And maybe sometimes health awareness is the right way to go, but sometimes when you have 90% of people knowing the health risks, it's something else that's affecting adoption rather than knowledge of the effects of smoke. So what were the results? So you can see on the leftmost bar on each of these is the control, people who just got the marketing, and then the rest of the bars are people who got the treatments. These aren't statistically significant. These could just be normal variations. They are going in the right direction, but you can't say with any rigor that this has had an effect. So for us, the conclusion is either that you need to do this with more people, but you'd have very small impact if you did. This wouldn't translate to a massive change in people buying cook stoves. But maybe more broadly, especially combined with the previous slide, that for this context, health awareness wasn't the main driver of cook stoves. The funding was for health awareness, so that's what we focused on. But it kind of brings back to the initial curly diagram thing, that there's a range of factors affecting things, and you sort of need to test to understand which one is the most relevant or which combination. Then just quickly, another study that we did with SEI. So we have a lab in our offices in Nairobi. We have around 10,000 respondents, mainly in informal settlements in Nairobi, who we bring in for various sort of behavioral games and experiments. And with SEI, we did a study where people were assigned to 2 different treatment groups. One, they were told there was only 1 cook stove available, which is looking at the effects of scarcity on improving, like, oh, there's only 5 left for the day. Are people going to be more willing to buy, which some studies have found? And then also aspiration. So showing somebody like you has achieved this in life, is that going to expand your mental boundary on what you think is achievable and the decisions you can make? There's a very nice study in Ethiopia where people get shown a documentary video for an hour, the treatment group, and then the other group gets shown something on people dancing. And then they come back in a year later, and there's been a significant increase in spending on education. So this is sort of where this move for aspirations and changing people's views of what they can achieve comes from. But the one thing I'll pick out from this study in the interest of time is that beyond that, everyone then had the option at the end to say, okay, well, we can give you some more information on cook stoves. And for half the group, they said, we only have like 10 sessions available, so only half of you can attend. And for the other group, we said everyone can attend. And the effect of this very small change was that there was a 25% increase in people wanting to attend these information sessions. So it went from around half the group to about 3/4 of people willingly staying beyond what they were supposed to be there for to find out about cook stoves. So I think this shows, along with a lot of other findings in behavioral science in different sectors, from microfinance to health to agriculture, that very small changes in programs and policies can have an effect. What exactly they are in cook stoves, I don't think that we know at the moment, and I think a lot more of this combination of qualitative work and quantitative testing is required for each context before we can really say, okay, well, this is the little tweak that's going to improve things, or this is not going to work, because I think in Kiambu County we found with health campaigns. So I think I'm getting signed, but I think I'm at the end. So the conclusion from our work, both in the cook stove sector and more broadly, is that like context matters, that it's really a case of understanding what decisions each population and each area are making, and that's going to change. And what we're doing, the reason I suppose we've set up is a lot of these studies on behavioral economics are done with Western university students, and they haven't been translated over into other contexts that much, which is what our research side is very much focused on doing. And in terms of cook stove uptake, understanding the decisions that each of these people are making in each population, as they can be very different, and then tailoring and testing interventions around that is to me like the next step to take. I would say one other thing in terms of sort of practicality. I think people are very wary of RCTs as being an expensive sort of cumbersome thing. But I think the other takeaway I'd say from this is that with existing programs, with existing products, little changes can be made very simply and tested in a much simpler way than these big 1,000 people randomized control trials. So yeah, going forward, I'd say like more research, more information, and more understanding. And I don't have to have the 0, which is good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's wonderful, Sani. Thanks very much for that. I'm sure on both of those presentations, people will have questions that we can bring up later. I know I do as well. So now I'd like to ask Deepti to come to the stage. Deepti is a doctoral candidate at Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and she's a rare breed, is Deepti. She is an engineer anthropologist, which to me is it's a bit like a vegetarian butcher or a gambling monk. But I think what it means is you have someone who really can appreciate the complexity and the different sides and the different sides of the equation and different perspectives that people are coming from. And this it makes the research Deepti's doing fascinating. I won't even try to explain, and I'll leave it to Deepti.
Thank you, Oliver. I am a vegetarian. I'm not a butcher, though. But yes, I am an engineer anthropologist. Okay. So my presentation today is going to be about how we can use ethnography to better understand user behavior. The outline for my talk is fairly simple. I have 3 main parts. The first, I'm going to tell you what ethnography is, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my sites of study, and then I'm going to go on to tell you why ethnography is useful to understanding user behavior regarding cook stoves, and hopefully, instead of telling it to you, I can just illustrate it to you by showing you some of the insights that we've gained by using this method that would not have been possible through any other method. So first, what is ethnography? It's actually both a verb and a noun. So it is the study and systematic recording of human cultures, and it's also a descriptive work, the product that's produced from such research. So it's both product and process. Today, I'm only going to be talking to you about ethnography as a process, and we can talk about the product during Q&A if you're interested. So how do you operationalize this definition into a research methodology? Well, usually it consists of an extended fieldwork, and the whole point of this fieldwork is to be learning emic terms and perspectives, which are basically understanding the perspectives, values, and priorities from the research subject's point of view. The idea is to be embedded into another culture, and then finally extract yourself mentally to be able to translate the emic terms into etic terms. Etic terms being those that from an outsider or observer point of view. So very broadly, I might think of all of us as having some etic terms about cook stoves, but cook stove users in different settings would have different varied emic terms. Okay, so as part of my doctoral research, I'm conducting a multi-sited ethnography, and I have 3 sites. The first are the kitchens, households, and communities that use biomass cook stoves. My second site are with actually cook stove implementers. And my third site are with researchers such as myself and my advisors. Again, today I'm only going to be talking about my ethnographic work in kitchens, households, and communities. Now let me tell you about my physical location. I'm situating this research in the northern Indian state of Himachal Pradesh. Shown on the left is a map of India, and shown in yellow is where Himachal Pradesh is located. It's a Himalayan state, and I'll show you photographs in just a second. On the right, you see an image of Himachal Pradesh. It's got 12 administrative districts, and my work is situated in the blob in the middle called Kulu. That's Kulu district. And so this is a typical view of what you're likely to see in Himachal Pradesh. It's a series of rural communities that are nestled in these Himalayan mountains. Like societies that we live in, they're complicated. They have different layers of social stratification, and we can talk about how those stratifications play out when it comes to cook stoves in the last part of my presentation. This is what a typical home looks like in the villages that I work in. And I want to tell you a little bit about the context of my ethnography. I've been doing this ethnography before and after a stove intervention. So I'm a researcher on a project where we're doing a large randomized control trial like Sammy just mentioned before. And this project is being funded by the EPA and the Global Alliance. And the ethnography that I'm doing is happening before and after the stove intervention. Households already use a vast array of different stoves. And this stove project then brought in a new array of improved stoves for households to choose from. So as you can see, we've got all kinds of single pot, double pot, different fuels. And again, I'm just going to, in the interest of time, move on, but we can talk about which stoves we offered if you're interested. So now I'm coming to the last, final, and most important third part of my presentation, which is about how ethnography is useful in understanding user behavior. And I'm going to particularly contrast it with other qualitative research methods, because I think that's where things can tend to be a little conflated. Well, first of all, when you're doing ethnography, you advance inductively. So what that means is that you don't necessarily have a hypothesis that you go out into the field to test. What it means is that you go in, conduct your research, and let your initial research tell you what terms and questions are important to the people that you're working with. So as I'll show you in just a minute, this allows you to really have issues come up to you from the ground, from the people that you're actually interested in studying. When I was doing research, for instance, I didn't think that religion and spirituality would have much to do with cook stoves. But when I went and started doing my work in Himachal Pradesh, I found that actually it has a lot to do with cook stoves and kitchens in Himachal Pradesh. And if I had gone with a social science survey, quantitative or qualitative, but if I'd gone in with a pre-made survey, I would have not included any questions about that at all. The next reason why I think ethnography is useful is because you get to learn not only what people say, but what they demonstrate through action in their daily lives. And the reason this is important is because, as we all know, there's not a direct correlation between what we say and what we do necessarily. And this is not because somebody is trying to deceive you or give you a wrong answer to your survey question. I think it's also because a lot of the things that, for instance, that I'm interested in studying, like values, priorities, those things are hard to articulate to oneself, let alone to somebody from, from a research organization that's come in from outside. So with ethnography, we get to be embedded into somebody's home, into somebody's lives, into somebody's communities, and we get to observe the way they make decisions, what they value, through direct observation. So now I'm going to share with you some of these insights. The first insight is that kitchens in Himachal Pradesh are actually sites where ideas of purity and pollution are very strongly enforced. Some of you may be familiar with the ideas of ritual purity and pollution that are very important in rural India, and these govern rules of gender and caste. And kitchens are sites where these ideas are extremely strongly enforced. So only the most purest things can come into the kitchen. And as you can imagine, we bring in our own ideas of pollution from an air pollution standpoint. And what you see is actually that there's a dissonance in Himachal Pradesh between emic and etic ideas of purity and pollution of stoves and fuels. So what I mean by this is that in Himachal Pradesh, most people think of biomass as being the purest form of fuel. And they think of biomass not only in terms of ritual purity, but also in terms of health. So they think that the food cooked on biomass stoves is actually healthier for you to eat than the food cooked on LPG. And as you can imagine, when air pollution researchers come in, they have a different perspective. They think that the purity of LPG in terms of its quality as a fuel is much higher than that of biomass. I want to point out here that LPG is not a technology that's sort of isolated from its context. LPG in Himachal, as elsewhere, but I'll only talk about Himachal, is connected to networks of power and access. So this regulates not only, for instance, how one gets a connection, but also how one gets delivery of refills. For instance, I work in 2 river valleys, and in one valley, there's only one distributor, and in the other valley, there's only one other distributor. The people who own those distribution networks are very well politically connected in Kulu. In fact, one of them stood for local elections to represent the entire district in the Legislative Assembly, happened to lose, but still they're politically connected enough to be able to stand for elections. And so if a household had a problem with, say, their LPG cylinder being leaky or being served to them half empty, or something else was wrong, they were getting a delayed refill, they really didn't have a lot of recourse of complaining, because if they did, they would conveniently be forgotten off the LPG distribution network for the next few months. So these are just things for us to think about when we talk about LPG adoption, is some of these other networks of power and access. Okay. The The next thing I want to say is that even though LPG might not be considered a ritually pure or a healthy fuel to cook with, it's still seen as an aspirational and modern fuel of convenience. What this means is that much like you and I might have a frozen pizza at home for when we know it's going to be really busy and we can't cook a nice, healthy meal, we still want to rely on it when in a time of pinch because they know it's quick to turn on, quick to turn off, and it's useful to have around the house. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is how enthusiastic is a household towards a stove project. So as I mentioned to you, I've been doing my ethnography before and after the stove project came in. And I think it's really interesting. So a couple of households dropped out of our study, like they normally, it's a typical thing that you see. And field staff and some of our project managers on the ground said it's because of survey fatigue. We asked them too many questions. We went back to the house too often. We had to collect sums, data, and so on. But when I was living in this household over several weeks, I realized that actually it wasn't survey fatigue and it wasn't project fatigue. The household was extremely interested in being a part of the stove project, but there was an interpersonal difference of opinion between the couple. So the woman and the man had a different opinion on whether they should be part of this project or not. And it had to do with their relationship to the field staff. One of them liked them and one of them didn't. One of them wanted them in the home and the other one didn't. So it was sort of an interesting dynamic to think about. And finally, my last slide is going to be about how ideas of gender empowerment vary by context. I think in the stove community, we've so far had a somewhat limited view of gender empowerment in the sense that we tend to think of it in terms of purchasing decisions only. So when we say that, is the woman of the house empowered to buy a stove? But I think that what constitutes an empowered woman varies by context a lot. So for example, in Himachal Pradesh, women make all the purchasing decisions. They decide what kind of fertilizer to buy, how much of it to buy, when to do what to the field. So I think ideas of empowerment have to take into account the nuanced context that they're embedded in. Okay, so I'd like to conclude by thanking a lot of people who've helped me do my work. This includes my dissertation committee, Rob Bayless, who's sitting here, Michael Dove, Shivaramakrishnan, and various collaborators and interlocutors, and all the organizations that gave money for this research to happen, and the Global Alliance for giving me a travel fellowship to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. That was great, Deepti. Thanks very much for those insights. And I understand it's ongoing research. It's ethnography. It takes time as well to really understand what's going on. So I'd like to invite our final speaker, Neha Juneja. Neha is a co-founder and CEO of Greenway, cookstove company in India. She has been internationally recognized for her excellence in product design, and I understand that her favorite cooking product is actually the timeless engineering classic, the wooden spoon, which hasn't changed in about 10, 20,000 years. So it's my favorite as well. So welcome, Neha. We look forward to hearing particularly about, from a cookstove company's point of view, like a product developer's point of view, how does all this relate? So what does it mean when you're actually trying to get cookstoves on the ground? So,
hello. So I am not a science person. I'm not an academic. So I'll give you a very commercial perspective on why understanding behavior and sort of making it a part of how your organization works is important. We are an India-based enterprise. We've been in operations for a little under 4 years now. We've done some 300,000 units in sales. And throughout that process, the biggest learning has been that your organization as a cookstove seller has to be about the consumer and not the product. So within the organization itself, within the team, the design team, the sales team, the admin team as well, there has to be more conversation about your consumers, your potential consumers, as opposed to more conversation around the product itself. Now, and that's important because what are we trying to do? Day to day, the biggest pressure that I have on my head is sales. I want to sell more stoves. And I also have pressure to ensure that my stoves are used in the long term. If someone in a community purchases my stove, we have some sales through microfinance, we have sales concentrated in particular districts and all. If someone buys my stove, they use it for 3 days, they don't use it thereafter, I can be rest assured that I'm not selling to that neighborhood again. So as a cook stove seller as well, from a very commercial point of view as well, both sales and adoption are critical to me. And hence it is my endeavor to make sure that whatever it is that prevents my consumer from buying and using, whatever barrier that exists, I should understand her well enough to remove all those barriers. That is my job as a cook stoves enterprise. So the questions that one can typically ask is from a typical consumer's point of view, not from our point of view as to why people should use stoves and why they shouldn't do traditional cooking anymore. Let's try and go into a consumer's mind and question, what does she know about traditional cooking? Does she even know that it's harmful? Does she actually believe that it's harmful? And how do we make her understand that message and imbibe that message? What does she want? Ideally, all of us want very fancy things, so our consumers also want very fancy stoves and all of that. And what is it that she needs? She needs something that's affordable, that's probably fits into her life easily, that's portable, things like that. Where is it that she finds it easy to purchase? That's another question that as cook stoves manufacturers we need to answer. You can make your product available in, say, under the public distribution system, but the public distribution system in most states in India is frequented only by men. It's a place where women don't have a lot of comfort in terms of asking questions about a new product, etc. So what is a comfortable setting for a consumer to purchase? And where is it that she finds it easy to learn and discover new things? If I could, I've always been wanting to demonstrate a product at weddings. Sponsor a part of a wedding, demo a stove there. We did that once, it was amazing. I mean, people came, asked questions about it, we cooked the wedding food on it, and we want to do more for that because that's one place people are happy, they're in a festive mood, they're carrying some cash, also very good. It is a lovely place to sell stoves. We should sponsor more weddings. Stoves company should sponsor more weddings. Weddings where there is no dowry exchange, one must be careful on that. And also it's very important to understand what constitutes value for the consumer. I'll come to that a little later. We did some, I'm skipping a couple of slides here, but we did some 10 different designs in the market when we were developing our range of stoves. And for each stove, we would make about 15, 20 odd prototypes, put them in retail shops, and wait for someone to pull out cash and buy them. For some stoves, no cash was pulled out. For some, all the stoves got sold. So we would give the stoves for free, but that told us that yes, this is something people see value in. And you would be surprised, it was not the most efficient stove or the most well-performing design of ours that sold the most. Because something was wrong in the ergonomics, the combustion chamber was small, things like that. So we need to, people, if you tell me that this bottle of water has X grams of calcium versus this has X minus 0.2 grams of calcium, and the other bottle looks more attractive, it looks cleaner, I'll probably end up buying that and maybe not the one that is healthier for me. So people make choices based on a different paradigm, which we as stoves designers or experts need to understand and balance. So I just broke down the problem of ensuring adoption into 3 parts. We've never done this before, but since I had to present here, I did that. The first being awareness, and this is a question that all stakeholders need to address. Yesterday in our group also we were discussing that what messages work with consumers, and I'll share one experience with you. About 3 years ago, most of our marketing was based on health. That buy a Greenway stove, it will ensure better health for you. It is, cooking on mud stoves is unhealthy and all of that. And that was a very boring message that made people realize that it stuck to people. People understood that yes, there's something wrong with traditional cooking, but no sales. And the reason for that was that if, as a cook stove seller, I give you a health message, I'm giving you that message only to sell. But if that same message came from, say, a doctor's association or a public health institution, it's a very valid message that sticks to people. And then, of course, I will go and sell on another pitch or so. So it's the responsibility of different stakeholders to spread different sets of information about clean cooking. The onus of spreading health-related information should not be on sellers by itself, because it sounds like a bogus message. And also there needs to be awareness about where a consumer can find an alternative solution, which is something that is on the manufacturer to do. Now, to ensure the first step to adoption of a cook stove is purchase. If people don't buy it, they're obviously not going to use it. So the first step as for us as a seller to ensure that there's purchase. And for purchase to happen, people need to see value for money. They need to be able to afford it. The product has to have credibility, and most importantly, even the brand has to have credibility. If I speak about ourselves, when I take my stove to the market, nobody has seen an improved cook stove. Nobody's ever bought an improved cook stove. Nobody knows what an improved cook stove is. So many times if I put a laptop in front of my consumers, potential consumers, they know it's a laptop. I put my stove and they ask me, oh, does it run on electricity? And you have to go into the whole cycle of telling people what it is, why is it good, and then why don't you buy it? And then there's this additional challenge. They've never heard of this company. Where did it come from? How old are you? And then why is everybody on your sales team 20 years old? So that and it's a $22, $23 purchase, which is a fair bit of money. If I open up my wallet in India at any given point in time, I am not carrying $23. If I have to spend $23, I'm going to think about it 4 or 5 times, be sure that it's worth my money. So building some of these aspects is very critical, and to build these aspects, to build this kind of product and brand credibility, you need to understand that what is it in the mind of your consumer that builds that credibility. We don't have all the answers to it, and perhaps we never will, but we've attempted a few. And then comes the next question of use. You need to ensure that your product is well performing. That's important in the long run. And also it's easy to use. Now, as I don't have the luxury of money or time to change behavior over a period of time. As someone who's selling stoves, as someone who's compelled to show sales numbers and other things, I want to make a product. I want to have a product that people find so easy to use. They don't have to change anything. It's so easy that they end up adopting some of the other aspects of stove usage easily. I mean, it should provide convenience. So I skipped this slide. This is just a quick thing of the different prototypes that we did. People like to use stoves indoors, outdoors, on a counter, on the floor, all of that, so your product should fit some of those spatial constraints as well. To build product credibility, the only way is for people to see the product in action. And hence, I believe all cook stoves manufacturers understand that demos is what works the best. And Oliver, you will have to help me with this. I just quickly want to show a TV commercial that we made to highlight 2 points. One is that if you have a TV commercial, even if it's not on TV, which is the case with us, you become a credible brand. Because people think you are on TV somewhere, we just missed you. That's one. And the other thing is that quickly the storyboard of this television commercial does not have any negative messaging at all. It does not shame you into being a mud stove user. Sorry. I'll just pause it for a minute because it's in Tamil, which even I don't understand. I think only Deepthi does here. So to quickly tell you the storyboard, it's a build-up of this lady who's the woman of the house, asking her kid to study for 15 more minutes, asking the vegetable vendor to give some extra vegetables, asking her husband to eat a little more, and just asking for a little more in life. Then she cuts into the camera saying that, don't you like it when there are some things that let you do more in life? And then of course, we cut into the Greenway stove.
அதனால தான் என் குடும்பத்துக்கு அதிகம் செய்ய முடியுது. அதிக சேமிப்பு மற்றும்
I think this is the first big broadcast of the television commercial, but nonetheless. Yeah, that's done. So the point that we're trying to make, that I'm trying to make, is from a consumer's point of view, buying a cook stove is actually a pretty big leap of faith. It's an unknown brand, it's an unknown product category, there is no established use case, and instead of, all of us need to work in order to give the consumer enough comfort to take that brave step of, buying and thereafter using a cook stove, and that, yeah, and that's that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Neha. Wonderful. So I'll please ask the presenters to come to the panel. We don't want to show Fiona's dirty desktop, so I'm going to put this one up. I think this is quite a nice diagram. So I'm going to take the liberty of being the chairperson to ask a few questions just to get us going, whilst you rustle up ideas that you want to or questions you would like to ask as well. So thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed the presentations as much as I did. So Fiona, the user-centric design seems fantastic. How do you get different people in the value chain involved in that design process? On the one hand, it's about product design, but could it also be about marketing design or something like that?
Yeah, hello? Yeah, definitely. I think there's so many different options. In this case, it was we were working with what we had, a program that was already started with a product already selected and a distribution model already in place. So what we were trying to use the method for there was to find ways to improve an existing distribution model. And even in the short time we had in Kenya and the pilot that we did, we managed to bring different stakeholders together. Unfortunately, not the manufacturer, that would have been great, but lots of other people involved in delivering the stove to the end user, and they themselves came up with really quick, cheap, easy to implement ways to improve the system from what they had. So, but you could just as easily go in before a product or a distribution model had been decided on and do a almost like needs assessment, working from scratch, bringing all of the stakeholders together so they could come up with the best possible distribution model. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Sami, how much certainty do we need from these types of experiments? There are kind of different levels of certainty that we get. How much more do we need, or at some point do we say, well, we have to trial and error instead of doing the research side of things to get the randomized control trial type of results?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think from a researcher's perspective, like endless amounts of certainty. I think from a more practical perspective, the idea, I think the reason that we work with private companies is because it's often a lot cheaper to get that certainty in that way. Like we're either by altering or like different parts of the product or different parts of a policy and testing that rather than just the trial and error approach. I mean, the other approach would be that you just throw everything at a product. We did that with one health program that just needed to get uptake. So instead of trying to find the right behavioral intervention, we just did everything and it worked. But you don't know what exactly is working there. So I mean, it really depends on, I guess, the client more than anything, and your trade-off in terms of proved effectiveness and just like getting stuff out there.
Okay, well, Neha, maybe you can reflect from your perspective. Sounds like you went through quite a few iterations, and it must have been, tough at times. You've got to keep going, keep trying. Can you speak a bit about that, about the process of, success and failure, and you have to, it's a learning process essentially.
It is. So everything that I thought of was wrong, almost everything. So like I said, the learning is that let the consumer tell you. The customer is queen. Let her tell you what kind of messaging she responds to faster. I was mentioning this yesterday also. If I look back at our marketing material from 3 years ago, I can actually cry. I can actually cry. It was just like vague. It wasn't I need to excite people into buying the product, and that excitement can come from, of course, making people aware of the importance of the product, but also building some sort of happiness in the joy of purchase. And and also you cannot replicate what commercial products do in the country, for that matter, or anywhere in the world. So you have to develop it on your own, which comes from a lot of conversations, which will come from a lot of difficult sales. And I once again would encourage all the researchers to make sure that their research goes to the end consumer. Your research comes to me, yes, I'm very happy to read it, but I'm not the one who's, if we can have some, for this public health research and other things, if a lot of it can actually seep down to the end consumer, that would be wonderful.
Okay, that's a very good message, and I think for me actually, you should take pride in the fact that of the learning experience, because it can be so easy to just give up if it's not working, and rather than sort of crying at the marketing materials from back then, actually take joy in the fact that now you've learned from that and moved on. I think that's really something to be proud of. What's interesting is, I think from a few of the presentations, this idea of understanding the user, but also suspending your own judgment of what the user wants, and that's very difficult to do, but it's a clear message coming out. Deepti, the ethnographic work is fascinating, but how do you retain the rich contextual data you're getting, but also extract key insights for perhaps practitioners or Stove developers? How do you balance that?
I think that's a really important question, and one that I struggle with myself. I think first of all, it's challenging to collect ethnographic data. It takes a long period of time, and it's a very different kind of field work, and it's something that in the Stove community, it's something that I don't think is built into projects all that much because of various things. But I think that the rich contextual information that ethnography provides us actually helps us to extract key insights from other forms of research methods. So as I mentioned, we're simultaneously doing a quantitative study, simultaneously doing an RCT, and I think that the ethnography actually helps us to contextualize not only what users are doing, but helps us to contextualize the results that the quantitative data is telling us. And so if anything, I think it gives us more meaning to the way in which we do any kind of research.
Okay, it makes me think of the economist's phrase, all else being equal. So how this contextual information can also sort of contextualize research that's very controlled, but not necessarily the real world. And I think that's a nice also way of thinking about merging the different approaches. I'm going to open up the floor now to questions. I'll pass this microphone around. So please raise your hand if you have a question or a comment that you'd like to make. And please let us know who you are, but then also who you're directing your question to. So I saw one here, and then we'll come here. Or we'll start here.
Hello, my name is Kenneth, and I work for Global Village Power. I'm from Ghana. My questions go to Niha. I want to know whether your product is in Ghana, and if it's not in Ghana, do you have intention of bringing it to the market? Thank you.
I have very strong intentions of getting it to Ghana, Kenneth, and we'll talk. We've been doing all of our sales in India, and it's just now that we've started exploring Africa. I'm very keen to meet with people and learn more, and yes, quickly get our stoves out here. We will chat, Kenneth. Thank you.
Oh, hi, I'm Dan Block from IDEV International. My company has done a lot of work with enterprises throughout the cook stove sector, both on distribution, financing, production, et cetera. And I think one of the key themes that comes out from a lot of the businesses, whether they're the larger businesses or the smaller ones, is that they have very kind of limited resources to focus on. They have limited resources throughout their entire kind of set of operations. So one of the things that kind of came to my mind is that it seemed like a lot of the focus in this panel or in the presentations were on focusing on the users for both the design of the product itself, as well as the design of the marketing and sales strategy to make both of those most applicable to the users. And I guess I'm curious with businesses that have limited resources, if there's one area or another or if it's either on the production design, the product design, or on the sales and marketing strategy that you would say is, or that anyone on the panel would say is a better use of limited resources if a business isn't able to invest a lot in both of those.
Okay, I'm going to collect a couple of questions, so I've got that one written down if you guys forget, but if there are any more. Yes, okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking in your experiment, Sami. So what my limited understanding on behavior, I'm not on that area, is that I've seen people react to things that change a lot with the geographical context. So between two neighboring villages, you might have total different responses. So you might want to internalize in your random strata by villages. If you mix all of them together, you might be getting a lot of noise, and that's why you're not seeing differences.
Hi, I'm Smita from the Ashton India Collective, and my questions to all of you. This is something that I've been, very interested in, and I want to understand your ethnographic and commercial and behavioral science perspective on this. What is it that can make more men cook? And it's a serious question. Do you think there is a feature, there is a certain kind of product that could make more men in the household share the responsibility of cooking? Is there something that you can share an insight on? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Shuchandra from India. So my question to Sami, you showed the performance of different marketing mix, like the SMS marketing as well as other. So I was just thinking, in perspective of India, it's such a high literacy rate. So do you, it's opposite, it's not having high literacy. Do you think that SMS, there could be any other alternative of SMS marketing? Was it really useful in other country perspective? The way you do you have any thought on this? And Neha, I would really like to understand how you are measuring adoption. You said the last 4 years, you now have seen the marketing, the thing which you have developed few years back, you were not happy about it. So how exactly you have seen the adoption, what you have sold 3-4 years back, and whether you have any insight on that?
Okay, thank you for those very useful questions. Interesting. We have a question on if your business funding is limited, what's the best option? Focusing on the user-centric product design or marketing? So Fiona with that one, and there was a comment on the villages, but I guess that's maybe just a comment. A question on how do we make more men cook? I've been thinking about this as well. I thought if we got them in the kitchen, is it just going to change everything? And I think that speaks to the gender aspect, thinking more broadly about power relations. We're always thinking about the woman and improving the technology for the women, or getting the women to buy the technology, but is there something broader, thinking about, does that really change lives more broadly, or social gender relations? And then the last question on the SMS marketing, Sami, and Neha, on how you measure adoption. So there's a question for everyone in there, I think.
Yeah, on the first question, with limited resources, I think if you're doing really good human-centered design, or if you're taking a sort of a really good systems approach, it's not inconceivable that you could do both at the same time, that you could both develop a product that people will like and will use and works for people in their wider context, but at the same time the distribution model that would support that product. And I think it's important that the two are considered together, because I think a lot of problems happen when you start to separate the two. When you take the product away from the system, you start to have problems, and this is what the customer journey map was sort of giving us, that great product, people loved it, but if you go deeper, you start to see difficulties with it. So I think one does not need to, I think both can be done at the same time, even with limited resources. Yeah.
So I'll answer the adoption question first. So we have, so we segregate our customers into two groups. One is a group that only relies on traditional biomass for cooking. Those are what we call the primary customers. And there's another set of users that do a lot of stove stacking. So they would have perhaps a kerosene stove in the house. For some months in a year, they might even use LPG, etc. Now, adoption, we are obligated to measure adoption, which is essentially doing 6-month surveys, practical, actual visits to see how well people are using our stoves. We do these adoption surveys only for our primary users. I've seen that it's very difficult to measure adoption for the second set of users who do a lot of stove stacking. But having said that, it's we have very concentrated sales. I would actually not sell if people were not continually using the product to at least their level of satisfaction. The other point I want to make is that we're happy to share some of this data also. What happens is once you get an improved cook stove, you'll start replacing, say, 50-60% of your cooking on a mud stove with, say, the Greenway stove. Over a month or two, that number becomes 70%. Another couple of months, that number might become 90-95%. But most users would not destroy their mud stove, or they would not completely give it up because it's an alternative. Why should I do that? I cook on my stove, but say I get a microwave, that does not mean I'll give up on my stove. I like to have options, all of us do. So, and I want to answer the question of what can we do to make men cook. I think we need stronger women to make men cook. Just stop cooking for men. That is what will make men cook. Women have to stop cooking for men.
I think that's a tagline of the conference. Stop cooking for men. Okay, Sammy.
So first on the villages, yeah, we controlled for village fixed effects. There's actually amazing results before you do that. The same with the lab, it's controlled for session fixed effects. So like, the results looked really nice the first time I ran them, and I was like, yay, and then I had to add stuff, and it got worse. So that's in there. In terms of SMS messages, yeah, that's not something we invented ourselves. There's a lot of studies, and a whole range of things like health, in terms of like getting HIV tests, microfinance, like savings, where SMS messages, and now they're moving to do them more at certain times. So for instance, before it was like we just send a message, and now it's like if you send a message when you're about to turn on your stove or you're about to go buy kerosene for a lamp, like those messages can be more effective to like change behavior. I don't think I have much to say on the men front. No, we're doing this research project just quickly, which is on like groundnut sellers in Zambia, which is traditionally like a woman's area. But then they invented or like brought into the area this like mechanized groundnut sheller, which now the men are all over the groundnut shelling. So maybe it needs to be more of like a thing rather than like a stirring action. Very useless comment, but we'll just go with it.
I guess I don't know what will make more men cook. In my study site, some men do cook. In fact, one of the gentlemen that I spent a bunch of time with is an elderly gentleman, so the whole family goes out to work in the fields, and during the busy season, everybody's out all day. And so he says, well, what am I going to do sitting at home all day? So he just like keeps food ready for people when they come back. So I think it goes back to what Oliver was saying, is about ideas of power relations within the home and ideas of responsibilities within the home. And I think this is something that, it's not an easy thing to study, and it's not an easy thing to change, but I think that is at the heart of some of the things that we're trying to do here. So.
Okay, thank you. We'll take another round of questions or comments. Yes.
Hi there. I'm Evan Coffey from the University of Colorado. And I was really curious about sort of the consumer. in these applications, and how you guys have addressed potential discrepancies between the product user and the actual purchaser cook stoves.
A quick question, how do you get the children involved? I want to know more. How do you get the children involved? And it,
I'm wondering, in terms of marketing strategies, to what extent you use the diffusion of innovations model, or you look for early adopters and you've kind of looked at the possibility of identifying those primary adopters, you know, to be able to then help propel the rest of the population.
Hi, I'm Kate from PATH, and first I just want to say thank you. Everyone's presentation was wonderful. This question's for Fiona. I was really intrigued by the idea of the consumer journey map, but sort of like we've been touching on in some of these other questions, that journey might look very different for different strata of consumer, and how you kind of aggregate that and account for the personal experiences at different income levels, locations, etc.
Okay, we'll take those. Great questions. Some of them very short and snappy, but not easy to answer, I think. We had one on regarding the consumer and the buyer of the stove and the user of the stove, I think it was. What your perspective is on that. One on how do you get children involved in this, and where do they come in? Another one on the sort of diffusion of innovation theories and following perspectives of getting early adopters on board first. Does that make a difference? And then about the consumer journey mapping, different journeys for different people, and do we aggregate, or how do we deal with those different journeys?
I'll try and answer the consumer versus customer question. Initially when we started, the perception was that it's men who hold the purse strings, and we need to convince the men that it's a good product, but we know men don't cook. They should, but they don't. So over the years, our endeavor has been to empower the consumer, which is the woman, to become the customer as well. Just empower women enough, give them enough comfort that they end up buying the product. Because you can get men interested and all of that, but they don't have the same kind of, twinkle in their eye when they see a demo and things like that. That's where you see our television commercial also. So what you typically, I'll give you now a slightly long answer, but you see how diapers are marketed. Diapers are actually good for the parents, because the child may be comfortable with a slightly more sloppy diaper as well, but it's essentially convenience for the parents. But you market the diaper saying that your baby will be healthier and things like that. Similarly with cook stoves, how we do is that we sort of tell the woman that you're doing something good for your family. You're not doing something good necessarily just for yourself. And hence, at least with us, the entire endeavor has been to make women feel comfortable enough to make that purchase decision and actually the purchase.
And do you have experience of early adopters and maybe how they have an impact?
Initially we did some, if there were early adopters, we didn't really let them adopt very well. So I don't have an answer on that.
Just quickly on the early adopters, I'm not sure ours was such a small pilot, but we already saw with this, we were working with women's groups, so we were looking at women's groups, microfinance working through women's groups, and already it was quite obvious there were early adopters, and this came out in the stakeholder meeting as a cost-effective way to support other users that were perhaps less confident and were having problems with the stove early on, were to use these early adopters. So I think definitely a way to enhance the distribution model and a very sort of low-cost fix that could be used. So definitely. On the customer journey map, since I have the microphone, yes, it's difficult. I think we need to remember that we were looking at the same system. That's the first thing. So if there's major problems or bottlenecks or disturbances in the system, you'll start to see people reporting it more or less consistently. Of course, there are, again, our sample was very small, and this is the first stage. We would like to try the method again to see what's happening, not just in Kenya, but elsewhere. But you do start to see the same thing. You see patterns, and of course there's outliers, and there's people that don't fit into this. But I think if you're looking for fixes to the system that's going to increase overall sales and satisfaction and adoption, it's a very useful model. Yeah.
Why not? And maybe just a couple of points on the early adopters, and that with the SEI Lab study, one of the sort of personality types that was more likely to pay more for a cook stove was this person who answered like highly on, I want to try new things, like I like to do things other people haven't, and they were willing to pay more. And I think in terms of looking at social norms, once you have certain people in the community, and I think this is like your point, but taking this up, then that provides a precedent which is really powerful. I think on the versus customer, like our studies got around it by looking at willingness to pay rather than actual payment decision. But I think there's a lot of research on cash transfers on money or financial inclusion, basically enabling better household decisions to be made on nutrition, on like education. And I would say this is probably one of them, that when you have financing options with stoves or availability of finance and loans, then you'll see like more of this translation. You can also, I guess, shift the intra-household bargaining power, but then that sort of just giving financial power to the woman has seemed to be improving things in other contexts.
I guess I only want to add something about the purchasing power within the household. We collected a bunch of quantitative and qualitative data, as I mentioned, as part of the RCT, and do a talk on Friday morning that describes that. But when you look at the results from that data, what you see is that in Himachal Pradesh, so we asked, who makes decisions within the home with regards to purchasing, different kinds of things. So it's not, health purchases versus consumer durable purchases. So we asked all kinds of things, and it turns out that in this particular context, most purchasing decisions are made jointly, and there's even like 7% of the households in one particular community, the women make all the purchasing decisions. So I think while certainly in some the consumer and the customer may be different, I think there are contexts in which purchasing is not solely a male domain.
The gentleman's question of involving children, I don't have the answer to that, but it is very important to involve children, not 4-year-olds, but children say in their teens or so. Simply because if you look at adoption of modern practices and modern products in the house, it is often led by children. It's often led by the younger generation, especially in India. And if you can just get young people aware about clean cooking in general, they'll make sure that their mothers, grandmothers also end up adopting them.
Okay, thank you very much. I think in the interest of time, we're gonna end it there. I'd like to give a big round of applause to our wonderful panelists. I won't try and summarize the discussion at all, but I hope you've all enjoyed it and it's given you food for thought for further discussions, because the coffee break is just next door, and hopefully you'll take up further questions and ideas with the panelists. And yeah, thanks very much for joining and for paying attention. Thank you.